Your healing was supposed to bring people closer. It destroyed your ability to stay. Jung understood this as the cost of individuation. Your body begins a silent refusal. You tolerate less. And he warned that this refusal can become its own mask. You feel it when your chest collapses at the family dinner, in the friendship buried under years of conversations that only went one direction. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why. You will understand why your nervous system is rejecting the people you used to love, why the people closest to you are meeting your boundaries with hostility, why the grief you feel is not about losing them, but about losing the version of yourself who could stay. But we are also going to confront something no one in this space will say. Your new standards are becoming a new mask. Your awareness is becoming a fortress. And the person sitting alone inside that fortress, diagnosing everyone else's unconscious behavior, is not healed. She is armored. Because the hardest truth of Carl Jung's psychology is that awareness always isolates before it liberates. You didn't become cruel. You became harder to control. Here's what happened to you before you had language for it. You got a text from someone who constantly crosses your boundaries. Before you even read the words, your stomach dropped. Your shoulders tightened. A wave of exhaustion passed through you that had nothing to do with sleep. You hadn't processed anything intellectually yet. Your body had already made the decision. This is not sensitivity. This is recognition. Jung wrote extensively about the relationship between the psyche and the body. He observed that in its lower reaches, the psyche loses itself in the organic material substrate. That instinct operates below the threshold of consciousness. That the psychoid zone where psyche meets body registers reality long before the ego permits the thought. He also observed that an instinct which has been too long denied can take its revenge in the form of an autonomous complex. In plain language, what you refuse to feel emotionally, your body will force you to feel physically. Your nervous system understood the transaction you were participating in before your conscious mind was willing to name it. Every dinner where you performed warmth you didn't feel. Every phone call where you listened for 2 hours and said nothing about your own life. Every holiday where you arrived already exhausted because you had spent the week preparing to be whatever version of yourself the room required. Your body was keeping score. The nausea you feel around certain people is your body physically rejecting a psychological contract you signed years ago. A contract of self-abandonment. A contract that said, I will absorb your discomfort so you never have to face it yourself. I will stay regulated so you never have to learn to regulate yourself. Your body is now enforcing a boundary your mind is still too afraid to set. And this creates a grief nobody warns you about. Because you are not just mourning the loss of difficult people. You are mourning the loss of your own blindness. And blindness was also warmth. Blindness allowed you to sit in a room with people who did not see you and still feel a sense of belonging. It allowed you to mistake being needed for being loved. And there was a genuine comfort in that mistake, a comfort that healing has permanently removed. Nobody mourns the loss of their own ignorance, but that ignorance was the thing that let you stay. Let me name what your tolerance actually was. You were not patient. You were afraid to leave. You were not understanding. You were emotionally dependent. You were not too nice. You were terrified that one act of honest refusal would confirm what you secretly believed about yourself, that you were not enough to be loved without performing. That is the architecture of the adapted self, not a personality, a survival structure. Built in childhood, reinforced in every relationship, and so deeply embedded in your identity that when healing finally dissolved it, you didn't feel liberated. You felt amputated. Because healing did not give you new preferences. Healing removed the anesthesia. You are not seeing the world differently. You are seeing it without the painkiller of self-deception. And the world, seen clearly, is full of transactions you once mistook for love. You can feel it at the family gathering when your sister makes a comment about your weight and everyone laughs. You can feel it in the friendship where you are always the listener and never the heard. You can feel it in the relationship where affection arrives only after you have given something first. You couldn't see it before, now you can't unsee it. And this is the turning point. Because when you stop offering this blind warmth, the external environment does not gently adjust, it reacts violently. If you stop rescuing everyone, who remains beside you? If you stop overextending yourself emotionally, who still calls? If you stop being the person who absorbs every crisis, who still thinks of you at all? These are not rhetorical questions. For some of you, these are questions you have been avoiding for years because you already know the answer. When you healed, you withdrew something. Jung would call it the withdrawal of projections. You stopped projecting the fantasy that these people saw you, valued you, understood you, and in that withdrawal, something horrifying became visible. Some people never loved you. They loved their access to you, your silence, your forgiveness, your emotional labor, your patience, not you. They loved their access to you. Think about that for a moment. The friend who called you her rock, she didn't call because she valued your mind or your humor or your perspective. She called because you would listen without judgment for 90 minutes and never once ask for the same in return. The partner who praised your understanding. He wasn't grateful, he was comfortable. Your endless accommodation meant he never had to grow. Your understanding meant he never had to face what he was doing. Jung described a state he called participation mystique, an unconscious identity between people where, as he put it, there is nothing like that absolute distinction between subject and object. You and the people around you were fused in a shared unconscious field. They did not have a relationship with you. They had a relationship with the version of you that served their needs. And you did not have a relationship with them. You had a relationship with the feeling of being needed. When you healed, you dissolved that fusion. You differentiated yourself from the collective. And the collective never celebrates differentiation. It experiences it as betrayal. Jung observed this directly, that the mass is swayed by participation mystique, which is nothing other than a shared psychic fusion. When one person breaks from that fusion, the mass cannot comprehend it. It attacks. This is why your mother calls your boundaries selfishness. This is why your oldest friend says, "You've changed," and means it as an accusation. This is why the person who praised your patience for years now calls you cold. They are not describing you. They are describing their loss of access to you. And the grief here is precise and surgical. You are not grieving bad people. Many of them are not bad. You are grieving the discovery that the connection was entirely transactional. You stopped being the therapist for your friend group. You stopped fixing their crises, and your phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was not peace, it was evidence. Some people only fitted into your life when you hated yourself. When you stopped hating yourself, they had nowhere left to stand. Some people only fitted into your life when you hated yourself. And now you sit with a question that nobody in the wellness space wants to answer honestly. Is this isolation the price of awareness? Is this the final destination? Or is there something beyond it that you haven't reached yet? There is. But reaching it requires confronting something far more uncomfortable than other people's manipulation. Here is where most content on this topic stops. The diagnosis, the validation, the reassurance that you were right to leave, right to set boundaries, right to protect yourself. And all of that is true, and this is where we go somewhere far more dangerous. There is a more disturbing question than, why did they treat me that way? The Jungian question is this: why did you accept it for so long? Jung wrote that whoever goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself, that the mirror does not flatter. It faithfully shows whatever looks into it, namely the face we never show to the world because we cover it with the persona. She looks at her 20 years of loyalty, 20 years of staying in friendships that drained her, romantic relationships that diminished her, family dynamics that required her to shrink. She called it love. She called it patience. She called it being the strong one. She wore that identity like armor, and everyone around her benefited from it. But the shadow shows her something else entirely. Her tolerance was not a virtue. It was a deal, an unspoken agreement that said, I will stay small so you feel comfortable. I will overgive so you don't leave. I will suppress what I actually feel so this connection survives. Because the alternative, being seen as difficult, being seen as selfish, being truly alone, was more terrifying than losing herself entirely. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. And the shadow is not only the darkness you hide from others, it is also the mechanisms of control you hide from yourself. Your generosity had conditions. Your kindness had a price. Your forgiveness had an invoice attached that you never sent, but always expected to be paid in the currency of loyalty. And the moment you see it, the moment you recognize that you co-created every dynamic you now resent, something in the chest collapses. Not from weakness, from honesty. The ego has scarcely even the vaguest notion of the forces operating beneath consciousness. A person afraid of abandonment can be guilted into anything. A person starving for validation can be manipulated with a single compliment. A person afraid of loneliness will betray themselves daily and call it compromise. These are not character flaws. They are unexamined agreements, and you signed every one of them. You were not betrayed by other people. You were betrayed by your own unexamined need to be needed. And your tolerance, the quality you were most proud of, was the instrument of that betrayal. It bought their presence with your self-respect. It kept the room warm by burning pieces of your own identity for fuel. This is why the mirror does not flatter. But there is a counter-argument here that deserves a serious answer. Some would say this is just cynicism dressed as consciousness, that not every act of patience was manipulation. That genuine love does involve sacrifice, and they are partially right. The shadow never meant every kind thing you ever did was secretly selfish. It means the pattern was operating alongside your genuine care, and you could not see where one ended and the other began. The confrontation with the shadow never reveals that you were a bad person. It is the far more uncomfortable discovery that your goodness was contaminated by need, and the contamination was invisible to you. And now, having confronted that wound, you face the ultimate individuation paradox. Because something subtle and dangerous has happened in the space between your old life and your new awareness. You have begun using your healing as a weapon. You sit alone now. And from that isolation, you diagnose everyone around you. Your mother is a covert narcissist. Your ex had an avoidant attachment style. Your former best friend was engaging in emotional enmeshment. Your colleague at work is projecting their unresolved father wound onto you. You have an entire clinical vocabulary for what other people are doing wrong, and you deploy it with the precision of someone who has read the literature, and all of it might be accurate. But the question Jung would ask you is far less comfortable. What are you using that accuracy for? If that question just hit somewhere specific, comment the word mirror. I want to see how many of you felt that. The persona, in the Jungian framework, is a mask designed to make a definite impression upon others while concealing the true nature of the individual. You shed one persona, the pleaser, the rescuer, the empath who absorbs everything, but you have quietly built another one in its place, the awakened one, the one who sees through everything, the one who is too evolved to tolerate ordinary human blindness. This is the shadow of the healer, and it is the most dangerous shadow in the Jungian framework because it disguises itself as wisdom. The person who will not tolerate anything is not healed. They are armored. Wisdom has become coldness. Perception has become judgment. Clarity has become a wall. And there is a very specific feeling that exposes this shadow. You know the feeling. It is the quiet superiority you get when you diagnose someone else's unconscious behavior. That small, private satisfaction of seeing through them. The way you nod along in a conversation while internally cataloging their defense mechanisms like a clinician observing a specimen. That is not integration. That is inflation. Jung warned that identification with an archetype turns a person into a flat collective figure, a mask behind which he can no longer develop as a human being. You have not transcended the persona. You have traded one mask for another. The old mask said, "I am endlessly available." The new mask says, "I see everything, and I am above it." And the loneliness of the tower is different from the loneliness of the cage, but it is loneliness all the same. You escape the prison of the pleaser, but you have built a tower, and towers, no matter how beautifully constructed, are just prisons with a view. So now you sit with the hardest question of all. If the old tolerance was blindness and the new intolerance is armor, then what is the third option? What does it look like to see clearly and still remain reachable? How do you come down from the tower without returning to the prison? Jung spent decades working on exactly this question, and his answer was not a technique, it was a capacity, something that emerges only when you hold two opposing truths in the same psychic space long enough for a third thing to be born from the tension between them. He called it the transcendent function. It arises, he wrote, from the union of conscious and unconscious contents, not the victory of one over the other, not the repression of the shadow, not the dominance of awareness over instinct, the union. He described this process in the language of alchemy. The confrontation of two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living third thing, a movement out of the suspension between opposites, a living birth. He described it as transmutation in the alchemical heat, the genesis of the subtle spirit. That language is deliberately strange. He chose it because what he was describing cannot be reduced to a step-by-step process, less a coping mechanism than a transformation. So what does this look like in your actual life? The practical expression of the transcendent function is what I call psychological tolerance, and it is nothing like the tolerance you practiced before. Psychological tolerance. Old tolerance was sleep. You could not see the manipulation, so you endured it. New intolerance is sight without depth. You can see the manipulation, but you cannot see the wound underneath it. Psychological tolerance is the third thing, the capacity to look at the person across from you and see the manipulation clearly, but also see the unhealed parental imago driving it, to see the passive aggression, but also see the child behind it who learned that direct requests get punished, to see the emotional unavailability, but also see the person who was taught that vulnerability means annihilation. None of this requires you to stay in every relationship, or return to self-abandonment, or absorb their pain again. It means you stop using your awareness as a fortress. Here is the practice. When someone behaves unconsciously around you, before you diagnose them, ask yourself one question. What would this behavior look like if I assumed it came from terror rather than malice? That question will never excuse the behavior, and it will never require you to tolerate it, but it dissolves the inflation. It dismantles the tower. Because in that moment, you are no longer the awakened one looking down at the unconscious masses. You are one wounded human being recognizing another. You can still leave the room, you can still hold the boundary, you can still refuse to self-abandon, but you leave with sorrow instead of superiority. And sorrow is honest. Superiority is just another mask. Jung wrote that the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona, all of them, including the persona of the healer, including the persona of the one who sees. The truly individuated person does not live in an ivory tower of absolute intolerance. They live inside a paradox, intolerant enough to refuse self-abandonment, tolerant enough to remain present in a flawed world without armor, perceptive enough to see the unconscious behavior, compassionate enough to see the wound beneath it. Call this passivity and you miss the point entirely. This is the most psychologically demanding position a human being can hold. It is the refusal to simplify, the refusal to collapse the complexity of another person into a diagnosis so you can feel safe. It is remaining present in a world you can finally see clearly, offering grace to the unconscious while requiring absolutely nothing of your own soul to be compromised in the process. Remember the room where we started, the passive-aggressive comment, the silence you let hang in the air. That silence was the first act of your individuation. It was necessary, it was honest, and it was also incomplete. Because there is a silence that comes from refusal, the body rejecting what it can no longer absorb, and there is a silence that comes from presence, choosing to remain in the room not because you cannot see, but because you can see everything, and you have decided that seeing clearly is not the same as leaving. The first silence breaks the contract, the second silence transcends it. You did not become cruel, you became harder to control. But the final stage of your healing is becoming harder to control without becoming impossible to reach. Awareness isolates before it liberates. Awareness isolates before it liberates. You are in the isolation. It is not the destination. It is the passage. And the passage ends not when you learn to tolerate everything again, but when you learn to remain soft in the presence of what you can finally see. That is the transcendent function. That is the living birth Jung described. Not the death of your standards, the death of the need to be superior to the world your standards have revealed. Comment the relationship where you first noticed your healing created distance. Then ask yourself, did that distance feel like loss or like clarity? If this video gave you language for something you have been carrying in silence, subscribe. We go to these depths every week. Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. 236 pages. Downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com.